I still remember the way the air conditioning hummed in that room. Room 714, Manila Hotel, the one with the view of the bay if you angled yourself just right beside the curtain. I remember the folder she placed on the glass table, cream-colored, with a little ribbon tie, like it contained something precious inside. I remember the soft light coming from the lamp in the corner, the kind of light that makes everything look warmer than it is, kinder than it is. I remember she was wearing a white dress that evening. She smelled like jasmine, and I sat there across from her, pen already in my hand, thinking to myself, this is what love looks like at 75. This is what I have been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting. I signed the first page without reading it. I signed the second page while she was pouring wine. By the time I reached the third, I wasn't even looking at the words on the paper anymore. I was looking at her. And that, I think, is the truest and most complete summary of everything that happened to me in Manila. I stopped reading the room because I was too busy looking at the woman in it. I stopped being a professional because I wanted so badly to be a man in love. That was my mistake. That was the door I left wide open, and she walked through it without breaking stride, without hesitating for even a single moment. My name is Martin Coles. I'm from Glasgow. I spent 40 years working as a property broker, buying land, selling buildings, negotiating deals, reading contracts, understanding the fine print that everyone else wanted to skip past. I knew better than almost anyone alive how dangerous it is to sign something you haven't read carefully. I had told clients that exact lesson 100 times over the course of my career. I would sit across from them at my desk and say, slow down. Take your time. Read every word on every page. Never let emotion rush a signature. Never let anyone make you feel that urgency is necessary when a pen is in your hand. I knew all of that. I believed all of that. I had built a career on all of that, and I signed anyway. That is what I have to live with now. Not just the money, though £530,000 is not a small thing to lose. Not when you are 75 and retired, and that money was supposed to carry you gently through whatever years you had left. What I truly have to live with, every single morning when I wake up, and every night before I fall asleep, is the knowledge that everything I knew, every lesson my career had taught me, meant absolutely nothing. The moment a woman named Roxane Dela Cruz placed a cream-colored folder on a glass table, put a pen in my hand, and smiled at me like I was the answer to every prayer she had ever whispered. That smile, that is where it all began and ended. I need to go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think. You cannot understand a fall unless you understand how high a person was standing first, and how solid the ground felt beneath them. I came to Manila not looking for love. I want to make that clear from the start, because it matters to me that you understand I was not a foolish old man who flew halfway around the world chasing something he should have known was beyond his reach. I came to Manila because my daughter Fiona had read an article about property investment opportunities in the Philippines and thought it might interest me professionally, give me something to engage with. And because my doctor back in Glasgow had sat across from me in his office 3 months earlier and told me, very plainly, that I needed to stop sitting in my flat staring at the walls. My wife Eleanor had passed away 3 years before. 38 years we were married. We had built a life together that was so complete, so interwoven, that when she died I genuinely did not know what to do with my hands in the morning. I did not know what to do with the silence at the table. I did not know what to do with myself at all. The grief did not announce itself dramatically, it just settled into everything, like damp into old walls, until the whole structure of daily life felt cold and heavy and slightly wrong. I booked a flight to Manila because staying in Glasgow felt like slowly disappearing, and movement, any kind of movement toward anything, felt like at least some form of still being alive. I stayed at a serviced apartment in Makati, one of those clean, functional places designed for business travelers who need efficiency more than comfort. I walked along Ayala Avenue in the early mornings when the air was still cool and the city hadn't yet risen to its full noise. I ate alone at restaurants and watched families eating together at nearby tables, watched couples arguing over nothing the way couples do when they are comfortable enough with each other to argue, and I felt the particular quality of loneliness that comes not from being unloved in your entire life, but from having been deeply loved and then finding yourself without it. It is a very specific kind of ache. It is not desperate. It is just persistent. The way a bad knee becomes simply part of how you walk after a while, something you accommodate into your normal routine without drama. And then, about 3 weeks into my stay in Manila, I went to a property consultation arranged through a local agency in Makati, and that is where I first met Roxane Dela Cruz. She was not the property consultant. She was the assistant, early 30s, small-framed, composed in the way that people are composed when they have learned through experience that patience and stillness get you further than urgency ever will. She had sharp eyes that caught everything in a room and a voice that was deliberate and careful, each word placed with intention. She handed me a folder of property listings when I arrived, told me her name, and shook my hand with both of hers the way Filipinos sometimes do as a sign of warmth and respect. I thought nothing particular of it. I thanked her and sat down with the consultant and spent about an hour looking at commercial properties in Quezon City, asking questions, taking notes. And that would have been entirely the end of it, except that when I was leaving and waiting at the elevator, she appeared beside me and asked, quietly, if I had any questions she might help clarify. Since the consultant sometimes moved quickly through technical details, and she wanted to make sure I had everything I needed, I said yes. Actually, I did have a few questions. And we talked for another 40 minutes standing in the lobby, and during those 40 minutes I realized she was sharper than the consultant had been, more comfortable with the legal and documentary side of property transactions, more precise about the things that actually mattered in a deal. I asked her how she knew all of this so well, and she said she had trained as a notary assistant, had worked in legal offices for several years, that documentation and contracts were her area of expertise. I respected that immediately. I have always respected people who know their craft properly and speak about it without inflation. We exchanged numbers that day as something straightforwardly professional. And then, because I kept finding reasons to send a message, and because she kept finding reasons to reply thoughtfully, it became something else over the following weeks. It became dinner at a restaurant along Roxas Boulevard where she told me about her family in Laguna Province, her younger siblings, her mother who had been managing a long illness, the years she had spent working double and sometimes triple shifts to keep the household from falling apart. She had this particular way of telling hardship stories without self-pity. She laid them out plainly, the way you lay out facts about weather. Here is what happened. Here is how I handled it. Here is where we are now. There was no performance of suffering in it, no reaching for sympathy. She just described her life honestly and trusted me to understand what it cost her. I found that quality almost startling in its familiarity, because Eleanor had been exactly that way, too unafraid of the difficult thing, unwilling to be made smaller by it. I told Roxanne that once, sitting over dessert at that restaurant, that she reminded me of my wife in that particular way. She looked at me quietly across the table for a moment and then said, very simply, "You must have loved her very much." I said yes. We sat with that for a while without speaking, and it felt like something real was passing between us. Maybe some of it was real. Even now, after everything, I cannot say with certainty that every moment was a lie. What I can say is that she understood me well enough to know which true things to say to make me trust her, and that is a kind of intelligence I had not accounted for. Over the next 2 months, I saw Roxanne almost every single day. We walked through the old Spanish-era streets of Intramuros on a Saturday morning, the sunlight coming through the stone archways, Roxanne explaining the history of each building with the confidence of someone who had grown up hearing those stories. We found small shops where I ate halo and attempted, badly, to pronounce Tagalog words while she laughed and corrected me with genuine patience. She introduced me to her friend Perlita, a warm and cheerful woman in her mid-40s who ran a small bakery in the Paco district and who seemed to genuinely like me, refilling my coffee without being asked, asking questions about Glasgow with real curiosity, treating me not like Roxanne's foreign project but simply like a person she was glad to have at her table. I liked Perlita. She felt uncomplicated and honest in a way that I found grounding. I also met Roxanne's younger sister Carminda, perhaps 25 years old, quiet and self-contained, where Roxanne was composed and precise. Carminda worked night shifts at a call center and lived in the same small apartment building as Roxanne. She barely spoke to me when we were introduced, eyes sliding away from mine, and I read it as shyness, as the discomfort of a young woman uncertain around a much older foreign man. I did not read it as anything else. I should have. I understand now that Carminda was uncomfortable because she knew things that I did not, and that knowing them while watching me sit there warm and trusting and completely unaware was something she found difficult to be in the same room with. But I did not know that then. I transferred money to Roxanne twice in those early months. The first time was for her mother's medication, a specific prescription that was apparently difficult to source and expensive, about £1,200. The second time was for a problem with her apartment lease, a landlord who was threatening to increase the deposit immediately or terminate the agreement, about £900. I want to be absolutely honest about this. I did not feel pressured either time. She brought these situations up the way you would tell a close friend about a difficult week, not as a request but as information shared between people who had grown close enough to share such things, and I offered. Both times I offered before she asked directly. She accepted both times with what seemed like genuine reluctance, a brief pause, a small protest, a quiet and somewhat formal thank you, as if accepting help cost her something personally. I thought I was simply helping someone I had grown to care about deeply. I thought these small things were the beginning of a shared life being built carefully and honestly between two people who had both suffered loss and who had, improbably, found something worth tending to. I was, in the back of my mind, already allowing myself to imagine asking her to come back to Glasgow with me, or at least to discuss something more permanent, something with a future attached to it. I was 75 years old. I knew, in the clear-eyed way that age forces on you, that whatever time I had left, I did not want to spend sitting in that flat, looking at Eleanor's empty chair. That knowledge was not self-pity. It was just honest accounting of the situation. The folder arrived in October. By then, Roxanne and I had been seeing each other for approximately 8 months. She called one afternoon and asked if we could meet at the Manila Hotel. She had booked a room for the weekend, she said. A proper treat for both of us, a real escape from the noise and heat of the city. I arrived first and poured a small drink from the minibar and stood at the window watching Manila Bay go gray and copper in the evening light. She arrived about 30 minutes later with a small overnight bag and the cream-colored folder with the ribbon tie. She set the folder on the glass table near the window and did not mention it immediately. We ordered room service and talked about ordinary things, a neighborhood she had walked through that afternoon, a story Perlita had told her, something funny her sister had said at breakfast. She was warm that evening, completely present, the warmest she had been in several weeks. I had noticed in the month before that she was sometimes slightly elsewhere, slightly distracted when we were together, as if a part of her attention was occupied by something I was not party to. I had noticed, and I had told myself it was work stress, that she had a lot to manage, that I was probably reading too much into small things the way people do when they are slightly afraid. That evening in the hotel room she was entirely herself again, or entirely whatever I had decided was herself, which at that point I could not have separated from each other even if I had been trying. I let myself relax. I let myself be happy to be there. After dinner she opened the folder. She did it casually, the way you might mention something you had almost forgotten to bring up, not urgent, not dramatic, just a natural transition in the conversation. She said she had been thinking about formalizing things between us. Not only romantically, she explained, though yes, that too, but also practically because she had an opportunity she did not want to miss. She wanted to open a small notarial and document services firm, using her training and contacts. And she needed someone to co-sign a credit line since her own financial history was not sufficient to secure one independently. She had also been thinking, she said, that while I was traveling between Glasgow and Manila, it would make sense for her to have the ability to manage some of my Philippine investments on my behalf, so that nothing sat idle between my visits. And for practical safety, she said, just in case something happened while I was abroad and she could not reach me, there was a general power of attorney document, standard, she emphasized. Nothing unusual. The kind of thing that allowed a trusted person to act on your behalf in straightforward situations. She had had the documents prepared by someone she trusted. Everything was in order. All she needed were my signatures in the appropriate places. I should have said, "I need to read all of these carefully first. Give me a day or two." I should have said, "Let me take these to my own solicitor before I sign anything." I should have said any one of the 20 clear and obvious things that I would have said without hesitation to any client sitting across from me in 40 years of professional life. Instead, I looked at her across that table in the warm light of room 714 and I thought, she is asking to build something with me. She trusts me enough to make herself vulnerable, to bring her plans and her future and set them on the table between us. That is what love looks like when it moves forward. I reached for the pen she was holding out toward me. She walked me through the pages the way a patient teacher walks a student through a lesson, methodically, calmly, a touch here, an initial there, a full signature on this line and this one. There were perhaps 12 to 15 pages in the folder. I read fragments. Phrases caught my eye in passing, authorized to act on behalf of, including, but not limited to, financial instruments, power to execute binding agreements, management of associated accounts. But I did not slow down and I did not stop, because while I was scanning those fragments, she was talking, softly and steadily, about her vision for the business, what she hoped it could grow into over the first 2 years, how much it meant to her to build something that was genuinely her own after years of working for other people's institutions. Her voice was a current that kept moving me forward through the pages, kept me from settling long enough in any one place to truly read what was written there. I think now that this was entirely deliberate. I think she had rehearsed the timing of it, which words to say, at which page, how to keep the pen moving before my eyes could focus. She understood documentation professionally. She knew exactly what those pages said, and exactly what they authorized. And she knew that the surest way to stop a man from reading a contract is to give him something more emotionally compelling to listen to while his hand is already moving. She was right about that. She had studied me well enough to know precisely what would work. In the weeks immediately following that evening, nothing seemed wrong or different in any obvious way. We continued seeing each other several times a week. The business was still in setup, she said when I asked, delayed by bureaucratic processing as these things often were in Manila. I did not press for details or ask to see documentation because I did not want to appear as though I was checking up on her, monitoring her the way an employer monitors an employee, rather than the way a partner trusts a partner. Underneath that reasoning, if I am being fully honest with myself, I think I was also afraid that if I looked at things too directly, I would see something I was not prepared to deal with, so I didn't look. I told myself I trusted her. I told myself that trust was a gift you gave freely, or it meant nothing at all. I went back to Glasgow in November because Fiona had asked me to come home for Christmas and I had promised I would. During those 6 weeks in Glasgow, I texted Roxanne most days, and she replied consistently and warmly. She said she missed me. She said Manila was quieter without me, which made me laugh because Manila is never quiet. I told Fiona about her carefully, vaguely, not wanting to speak too much of something I was still uncertain how to describe. Fiona listened without comment for a while and then asked questions I answered around the edges of. She looked at me with the particular careful expression that daughters develop when they have watched their fathers go through grief and come out the other side fragile in ways the fathers don't fully recognize in themselves. I returned to Manila in January. Roxanne met me at my apartment, and she seemed subtly different, not cold, but managed, the way a person is careful around a conversation they are trying to control before it finds its own shape. I told myself it was the strangeness of reconnecting after weeks of distance, the adjustment period that all relationships go through after separation. We had dinner and she was warm enough and present enough, and I pushed the discomfort I felt down into a place where I did not have to look at it directly. But over the weeks that followed, she became progressively harder to reach. She had meetings. Her mother's health had shifted. The business was at a complicated juncture that required her full attention. She came and went from my life with a frequency and a casualness that slowly rearranged my position in it. I was becoming someone she fit in when convenient, rather than someone she built her days around. And I felt that shift the way you feel the temperature in a room drop without being able to name the moment it began. The first call I did not understand came in February. It was from a Philippine bank. I had no account with a credit line in my name that had apparently been activated months earlier and drawn upon in the amount of approximately £74,000. The man on the telephone spoke with careful formality and asked when I planned to address the outstanding balance on the first installment cycle. I told him with complete certainty that there had been a mistake, that I had no account with his institution, that my name had been used in error. He gave me a reference number and explained that the account had been opened using my passport details, verified with a signed authorization form bearing my signature, and that subsequent withdrawals had been made at intervals across the preceding 3 months. I sat on the edge of the bed in my Makati apartment after that call and felt something cold begin in my chest and move very slowly outward into my hands. I sat that way for a long time without moving. I called my bank in Scotland that same afternoon. My account manager, a woman named Mrs. Drummond, whom I had dealt with for many years, told me she had been meaning to contact me. There had been a series of substantial international transfers from my primary accounts across the preceding 6 months, each structured carefully below the threshold that would trigger an automatic compliance review. The total across all transfers was approximately £387,000. Every transfer had been authorized, using documentation held by a named representative, someone who held a valid and comprehensive power of attorney over my accounts. She read me the name. She read me the specific clauses from the power of attorney that had been invoked to authorize each transfer. And as she read those clauses aloud, I heard, for the first time, what the pages in that cream-colored folder had actually said. Not what Roxanne had told me they said while I was nodding and holding the pen, what they actually, legally, specifically said. The difference between those two things was the difference between a partnership and a total surrender. It was everything. I hired a lawyer within 3 days. His name was Adi Velarde, recommended by a British expat group I found online. He was a small, quiet, methodical man who listened to everything I said at our first meeting without interrupting and without reacting visibly to anything, which was either professionalism or long experience with situations exactly like mine. He spent a full week examining the documents Roxanne had had me sign before we met again. When we sat down the second time, he laid out what had happened with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. The power of attorney I had signed in room 714 was not limited. It was not conditional. It was not the basic emergency authorization Roxanne had described while guiding my pen across the pages. It was a comprehensive, broadly worded instrument granting her full legal authority over every financial vehicle associated with my name, the ability to open credit lines, authorize international wire transfers, execute binding financial agreements, access and draw upon investment accounts, and act as my legal and financial representative in virtually any context she chose to apply it. The business co-signature had authorized a credit facility she had promptly drawn against to its maximum permitted limit. The investment management authorization had given her access to 2 Manila-based investment accounts I held, both of which had been drawn down to near zero across a period of 4 months. Across every instrument combined, the credit lines opened, the accounts drawn upon, the international transfers executed. The total was approximately £530,000. Adi Velarde also told me something about the documents themselves. The woman who had notarized them, who had affixed official-looking seals and signed as a certified witness to my signature, was not a registered notary. She was an employee at a commercial printing and document services shop in the Ermita district, someone who had access to embossing equipment that had been used to create what appeared to be official notarial seals but were in fact entirely fraudulent. The witnesses listed on the documents were Carminda, Roxanne's sister, and a cousin of Roxanne's I had never met. Legally, he told me, the fraudulent notarization was a ground for challenge. It weakened the enforceability of the documents significantly. But the challenge, he said carefully, was complicated by one central and irreducible fact. I had signed. I had signed freely, without coercion, in a private hotel room, under no visible duress, over the course of an unhurried evening. No one had held my hand. No one had threatened me. The pen had been mine. Whatever I had failed to read or understand, the signatures were mine, the decisions were mine, and unwinding the legal consequences of decisions freely made, even decisions made in emotional fog, even decisions made while being deliberately misled, was a long and expensive and uncertain process. That was the truth of it, and he was not going to soften it. I tried to reach Roxanne in the days that followed my conversation with Addie Velarde. Her phone rang until it didn't. The line was eventually disconnected. Her apartment, when I went there in person and knocked on the door, was empty in a way that told you immediately it had not been recently vacated, but had been planned to be vacated for some time. The closet rails had been bare long enough to leave faint marks in the dust. The kitchen had been wiped clean. The small things that accumulate in a home you actually live in, the personal objects, the sentimental clutter, the evidence of daily life, were entirely absent. She had not left. She had concluded. There is a difference, and you feel it immediately when you walk into a space where someone chose to disappear rather than simply go. I knocked on Perlita's bakery door 2 days later. She opened it partially and looked at me for a moment before speaking. She said she didn't know where Roxanne had gone. She said it quietly and didn't elaborate, and she looked at me with an expression I did not know what to do with. Not surprise, not shock. Something older and heavier than either of those. Something that wanted to be an apology but did not have the courage to become one. I did not push. I thanked her and left. I walked back to my car through the Paco Street Market and sat in the driver's seat for a very long time with my hands on the wheel and the engine off. The city went on around me in every direction, completely indifferent, completely alive, and I sat there alone in the middle of it, understanding for the first time the full shape of what had been done to me and the full weight of my own role in allowing it. Fiona flew to Manila in April. She did not say "I told you so," which I had half anticipated and probably deserved to hear. She did not do any of the things that fear sometimes makes adult children do when their elderly parents make catastrophic mistakes. She did not treat me like someone who had lost their judgment permanently, did not take over in a way that diminished me, did not perform her concern in ways designed to make herself feel better rather than to actually help me. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and asked, simply and directly, what I needed. When I said I wasn't sure yet, she put a folder on the table between us. She had researched everything before she boarded the plane: the British Embassy's support contacts for citizens in financial and legal difficulty, the details of a specialist fraud solicitor in Glasgow named Mr. Calder, who worked specifically in international fraud recovery cases, the name of a Philippine financial recovery firm that Addie Velarde later told me had a solid reputation. She had assembled all of it before she left Scotland, which meant she had been preparing to help me before I had even asked, which meant she had understood the situation perhaps more clearly than I had allowed myself to. When I understood that fully, when I realized she had gotten on that plane already equipped to rescue me, I sat at that kitchen table and cried in front of my daughter for the first time since the morning of Eleanor's funeral. I am not embarrassed by that. I think it was necessary. I think something needed to break open before it could begin to close properly. The legal process that followed lasted 7 months. Addie Velarde pursued the fraudulent notarization through the appropriate Philippine legal channels. The print shop employee was identified and interviewed, confirmed she had no legal standing or registration as a notary, and her participation provided grounds to seek nullification of the documents on the basis of procedural fraud. In parallel, Mr. Calder worked with my Scottish bank to freeze what could still be frozen and contest the most recent transfers. Ultimately, we recovered approximately £89,000 funds that remained in accounts that had not yet been moved, and that the bank agreed to return, given the documented evidence of fraud and the compromised power of life. The attorney. The remaining £441,000 was not recovered. It had moved through too many intermediate accounts across too many jurisdictions to be traced effectively, and tracing it even partially would have cost more than the recovery could realistically justify. Roxanne was never found. A warrant was issued through the appropriate Philippine authorities, and Addie Velarde filed the relevant criminal complaint. But he told me, with the same plain honesty he had shown me throughout, that enforcement was a separate matter from legal procedure, and that I should manage my expectations about what the process would practically deliver. I did. By that point, I had stopped expecting justice and started simply trying to understand what had happened well enough that I could carry it without it crushing me entirely. The credit damage followed me home to Glasgow and took months more to manage. Defaulted lines of credit associated with my name required formal challenges, documentation from the legal proceedings, extended correspondence with credit agencies. I simplified everything, sold a property I had been holding in Edinburgh as an investment, restructured my accounts, arranged for Fiona to have oversight authority over my primary finances. Not because she asked for it, because I recognized in myself a need for a period of supervised humility, a season of being checked on, of having someone else looking at what I was doing with what I had left. She handled it without making me feel reduced or foolish. She treated it as a practical arrangement between two adults, which is precisely what it was, and I was grateful for the dignified way she managed it. I think about Roxanne sometimes, late at night mostly, when Glasgow has gone quiet and the rain comes against the windows the way it does for months at a time in a city that never fully makes peace with its own weather. What I feel when I think about her now is not what I felt in the first weeks after I understood what she had done. In those first weeks, there was something that burned, not quite rage, because rage requires a kind of energy I did not have, but something hot and disorienting. A sustained shock that kept rearranging itself into new forms every time I thought I had processed it. What I feel now, many months later, is something quieter and more bewildering. I think about what was performance and what was real. I think about whether she felt anything during those months, whether there were moments of genuine connection that she had to suppress or manage in order to keep moving toward the plan, or whether she was so completely inside the performance that the distinction between feeling and performing had simply ceased to exist for her. I do not know. I will never know. What I know is that she was patient. 8 months is a long time to maintain a persona. 8 months of dinners and walks and gentle conversations and careful warmth, all of it moving steadily toward a cream-colored folder on a glass table in a hotel room. That required not just intelligence but discipline. It required her to understand me well enough to calibrate her behavior precisely, to know when to be warm and when to be slightly distant, when to be vulnerable and when to seem self-sufficient, how to build trust incrementally without ever pushing so hard or fast that I might pause and look at things clearly. She had studied me before she ever appeared beside me at that elevator. She had understood what I was missing, and she had built herself into the exact shape of it. That is the thing I keep returning to, not because it makes me feel better, but because I think it is important to name it honestly. She did not simply deceive me, she understood me, and she used that understanding as a precise instrument against me. I was a property broker for 4 decades. I read contracts for a living. I understood power of attorney documents in the same way most people understand their own handwriting, not as something to be puzzled over, but as something utterly familiar, readable at a glance. And none of that knowledge, not 1 year of it, not one lesson from 4 decades of professional life, protected me in that hotel room. Because the thing that undid me was not ignorance of the words on those pages. The words were in a language I knew perfectly. The structures were ones I had worked with professionally for most of my adult life. What undid me was the need sitting in my chest, the deep, persistent, human need to believe that the woman across from me was real, and that what was happening between us was real, and that I was still someone worth loving at 75 years old, still someone whose future could hold warmth and companionship, rather than just the long, quiet winding down of things. She did not defeat my professional knowledge. She defeated my loneliness. And loneliness, I have learned at significant cost, is a more powerful force than any qualification or professional training. It moves faster than intellect. It bypasses everything you know and speaks directly to what you need. And what you need always feels more urgent and more true than what you know. I did not understand that about myself until it was far too late to do me any good. I am home now. Back in Glasgow. Back in the flat where Eleanor's chair still sits in the corner of the sitting room. I walk along the Clyde in the mornings when my knees allow it, and I watch the water and breathe the cold air and let myself simply exist in the city I have known my whole life. I have Fiona over for Sunday dinners, and I listen when she talks about her children, my grandchildren, their small daily dramas, and I am genuinely present for it in a way I was not always capable of in the years immediately after Eleanor died. I have started carefully organizing Eleanor's belongings, not removing them, not erasing her from the rooms, but placing things thoughtfully, finding the right place for each thing, which is work I was not ready to begin for the first 3 years after she died, and which I find I can now do without it breaking me open. That feels like something. I cannot name it precisely, but it feels like movement of the right kind. I still go back to that room. Not literally. I never returned to the Manila Hotel after everything happened, and I do not intend to. But in my mind, I go back regularly and without warning. I am there in room 714, and the air conditioning is humming, and the bay is darkening through the window, and the cream-colored folder is on the glass table, and Roxanne is across from me, in her white dress, smelling of jasmine, and there is a pen in my hand. I go back to that moment, and I sit in it, and I try to see it clearly, not with the warmth I felt then, and not with the bitterness I felt later, but with whatever honest understanding I have been able to build in the time since. I see a man who knew better than almost anyone what he was doing when he picked up that pen and did not use any of that knowledge. I see a man who chose, because the choosing felt like love, to believe what he was told rather than read what was written. I see a man who wanted so badly to still be someone's beginning that he signed away his own future without looking at what he was writing his name on. I see all of that clearly now. 75 years old, 7 months of legal process, £530,000, a woman who planned everything from the first handshake at that elevator. That is the whole of it. And what I have learned, at a price I would not have agreed to pay, is that a signature is not an act of love. It is a legal instrument. It is the most binding thing a person can give. And you do not give it to someone because they are wearing a white dress and smiling at you like you are the answer to their prayers. You read the document first. You read every word. You go slow. You bring someone you trust. You do not let the light in the room, or the sound of her voice, or the shape of your own longing hurry your hand across the page. I knew all of that. I knew all of it. And I have spent every quiet night since October in room 714, pen in hand, wishing I had simply stopped and read.